Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional league, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
And welcome to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kenneth Gruenfelder, and we got a great show for you tonight. We got a lot of stuff to talk about. We got a couple of segments that I want to get to for tonight's show. Just like last time, we're going to go through 4 different segments for tonight's show pertaining to different lists that I constructed. So for the first list that we're going to go through, we're going to kind of touch upon players in the NFL that switch teams in the offseason that I think are essential for you to draft to your fantasy team. The second segment for tonight's show are players that I'm kind of interested to see how they're going to perform on their new teams. Our third segment is going to be geared towards players that are poised to have bounce-back seasons, guys that have gotten injured in 2020, guys that have had down years that I think are poised to have bounce-back seasons in 2021. And then for the last segment, I'm going to talk about players that I've drafted over the years that I really enjoyed having on my team, guys that I loved to have had on my team in certain years that have helped me win my championships in different fantasy leagues over the years. So those are the 4 segments for tonight. So let's get into it. So with these lists, I'm going to be doing it a little bit differently than I did the last time I did my lists for the previous show. So with the first segment, here we go. Players that have changed teams that I believe are fantasy essentials for the 2021 season. So going in no particular order, this player actually made my list in the last show, and that is Curtis Samuel, who was recently signed by the Washington football team. I think this is a guy that you definitely want to have on your team in the fall. He was kind of the forgotten man in Carolina, being the kind of the third option between Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore. And obviously when Christian McCaffrey played the 3 games that he did play, Curtis Samuel's production kind of suffered because of that. But the Panthers tried to utilize him in different roles. They had him coming out of the backfield. They did some end arounds with him. And he did have a very productive fantasy season, albeit with the other weapons that were in this lineup for the Carolina Panthers. But now that he goes to Washington, I think that with him being the number 2 option to Terry McLaurin, I think he's going to excel in that role. And I think he could definitely be a number 2 wide receiver on your team, whether you're doing standard leagues or PPR. Because I think they could definitely implement some of the scheming that they did in Carolina with this player. And maybe you could see Curtis Samuel coming out of the backfield for the Washington football team. He's definitely going to get some targets. The one thing that you have to be concerned about, and I've touched upon this many times in the past, is quarterback play. And it's going to be interesting to see what Washington does at the quarterback position, because they did bring in Ryan Fitzpatrick. They re-signed Taylor Heineke. So it's going to be interesting to see if Washington is going to commit to Fitzpatrick being the starter. Or is Washington going to draft a QB in the upcoming draft? Who knows? But I think Curtis Samuel definitely is a player that you could definitely get in the later rounds of your fantasy drafts, and he can definitely be a good flex option and even a possible wide receiver too in your fantasy leagues. So another player that I put on my list is Will Fuller. Will Fuller had a great season for Houston, and this is coming off of obviously the trade that Bill O'Brien made in the offseason to trade DeAndre Hopkins to the Arizona Cardinals. Will Fuller kind of stepped in and became that number one wide receiver. And, this is a guy that has had a hard time staying on the field, and he hasn't been healthy throughout his career, but he had a productive season, and of course it got cut short due to the suspension and the PED use that he was caught with. So I think he's going to do well in Miami. Now, again, this is another scenario where it's all about the QB play as well. It seems that Miami is committed to starting Tua Tagovailoa, and it seems like he's going to be the guy moving forward for this Miami Dolphins team. And I think now when you pair Will Fuller next to Devontae Parker, I think that's going to open the door up for this Miami Dolphins offense. And I think these players are going to benefit from it. I think Will Fuller is definitely going to benefit from that. He's a guy that can take you over the top. And let's see what Tua could do with that. If Tua can develop a better deep ball, because I think a lot of people have been questioning Tua on his deep ball. And Will Fuller is a deep ball guy. He's a fast guy. And I think he could definitely be a guy that you can get in the later rounds. He's a guy that you could definitely put at the flex, can be your number two wide receiver. And I just think that his talent is so high. His ceiling is so high. When he's healthy, he could definitely help your fantasy team if you draft him in the fall. So, kind of going to another player on my list that I included, I'm going to go with Marvin Jones. Marvin Jones is a guy that I think a lot of people would say he's very touchdown dependent, and he's very inconsistent. Let's put it like that. He's very inconsistent. He can have a game where he drops 27 for you, and then he can have a game where he drops 4 points for you. And I think it's interesting that he picked Jacksonville as his destination. I think there was definitely better options for him to sign with. But you know what? I think that him going to Jacksonville and him being paired up with DJ Chark, and most likely Jacksonville is going to draft a quarterback, and that quarterback is going to obviously be Trevor Lawrence. I think that Marvin Jones can excel in that. I think he could definitely develop a rapport with Trevor Lawrence, and I think because of that, you could definitely see him being another touchdown-dependent wide receiver, like I mentioned before. But I just think that Trevor Lawrence is definitely going to benefit from having this guy on his team. And I think he's somebody, again, that you can get in the later rounds. And he could be a flex option. He could be a number two. I think really he has the potential to be a number one wide receiver in Jacksonville, because maybe he overtakes DJ Chark and becomes that number one wide receiver that Trevor Lawrence needs to excel if he is drafted by Jacksonville, which in likelihood is going to happen. I think Trevor Lawrence is a lock to be a Jacksonville Jaguar when the draft happens later this month. But you know what? I think that Marvin Jones, as long as he stays healthy too, that's another thing you got to be concerned about, is health. I think that if Marvin Jones is healthy and he can develop a good relationship with Trevor Lawrence, I think the sky's the limit for what Marvin Jones can do. He's a dependable wide receiver. Now, like I keep saying, he could be touchdown dependent, but I think in fantasy football you need that to help your team excel. So I would say another guy that switched teams that you should maybe look at getting on your team is a guy like Marvin Jones. So with one of my other players that I picked Jonnu Smith, who signed with the New England Patriots in the offseason. I think that this is a guy that can definitely help your team, because when you look at the position of tight end in fantasy, outside of George Kittle and Travis Kelce, it's a lot of hit or miss when it comes to the tight end spot. And you definitely have to be very careful with who you draft at tight end, because it might not always work out. And also, I forgot to mention Darren Waller as well. He's probably the third best tight end outside of Kelce and Kittle. Now, not to say that there's no good tight ends in the NFL besides those guys, but when it comes to fantasy, and especially in PPR, because, Travis Kelce was a monster this year when it came to PPR, tight end is not really the best position. It's not usually a team's strength. I know from experience, a lot of the guys that I've drafted at tight end that aren't Travis Kelce or George Kittle or even Gronk back in his prime, it really didn't work out. I've drafted guys like Jason Witten, Evan Ingram, who I drafted in 2019 and had a great opener, but then he struggled to stay healthy and really did not play up to what I expected him to play. And there's really no, unless you have Kittle or Kelce or Waller, you're going to struggle. Your tight end spot is going to be hard to fill, because there's only a select few tight ends that you really can rely upon. Now, I think Jonnu Smith can definitely be a tight end that can have a good season, because when you look at the team that he went to the New England Patriots. Now, they also brought in Hunter Henry as well. And I talked about this on the last show, but the Patriots, they love to do the two tight end sets. They love that. And I think that's only going to help Cam Newton, and I think Cam Newton is going to try to get these guys involved as much as he can. And the Patriots last year, their tight end spot was terrible. It was horrible. The Patriots' skill positions was one of the worst in the NFL. And, they needed weapons. And Jonnu Smith, I think, can definitely provide stability at that position. And he's definitely going to get targets. I think he is. The Titans have used him. They've definitely done end arounds with him in the red zone. He's definitely going to get red zone targets. I remember in the playoff game against the Ravens in 2020, the 2020 divisional round against the Titans. Oh, sorry. The 2020 divisional round, Ravens and the Titans, Jonnu Smith had that one-handed touchdown, which was insane. The guy's athletic too. I think that he's going to get targets. And especially, if you're doing a PPR league, you're going to want to have a guy that gets targets. And Jonnu Smith is definitely a tight end that can see targets. And like I mentioned, tight end can be a very thin position when it comes to fantasy. So you could definitely get Jonnu Smith in the later rounds. I don't think he's going to be a guy that's going to be taken off the board immediately. Because also, again, this is another guy, there's questions at quarterback. Cam Newton did not have a good season last year in terms of passing, but in the running game he was effective. So hopefully with the addition that the Patriots have had in the offseason, their offense is going to be better. I think it's going to be better. I think it's going to be a lot better than what it was last season. So we're going to have to see what happens. But I could see Jonnu Smith being like the 6th or 7th tight end taken off the board, because you're going to have Kittle and Kelce, Waller. You're going to have even Robert Tonyan, who had a good season for the Green Bay Packers. And there's a couple of others that kind of slipped my mind. But Jonnu Smith, I think, could definitely be a top 10 tight end in the NFL. And I think he's going to benefit from being signed to a team that loves to use the tight end spot, loves to utilize the tight end spot to the best of their abilities. So Jonnu Smith is another player that I think that switch teams that will be considered a fantasy essential when you start drafting your teams, whether it's late summer, early fall. So the last player that I have on this list is kind of a no-brainer. This one's kind of if I was doing a rankings of this of the players in this list, I think he'd be number one, and that's Matthew Stafford. Matthew Stafford was with the Lions his whole career, and they traded him in the offseason to the LA Rams, and he will be the starter come September. And I think he should have a great season. I really do. The offensive line for the Rams is pretty good. They added Deshaun Jackson to go along with Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp. They got a nice running back committee. Cam Akers, most likely going to be the number one running back on the Rams. And just kind of going through Matthew Stafford's career numbers, he's got 45,000 passing yards. He's got 282 touchdowns, 144 interceptions. Last season, he passed for over 4,000 yards, had 26 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. It's pretty solid. It's a solid season on a team that basically does nothing every year. And who could forget his 2011 season when he passed for 5,000 yards, 41 touchdowns, 16 interceptions. The one thing for Stafford is doesn't have a playoff victory, but then again, this is fantasy. Matthew Stafford is somebody you could definitely get in the later rounds as well. I've been saying the later rounds pretty much this entire segment, but these are guys that you could definitely get in the later rounds because, there's going to be guys that are going to take them over Matthew Stafford. I mean, guys like Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Russell Wilson, Aaron Rodgers. There's guys out there that you're probably going to want to get before Matthew Stafford, but he's definitely going to be somebody that you're going to want to get if he's available. He's definitely going to put up points. And I think that being paired up with Sean McVay, who's a great offensive mind, he's going to get his opportunities. And I think the weapons that he has at his disposal with Robert Woods, with Cooper Kupp, as long as they stay healthy, the sky's the limit for this offense. And I think Matthew Stafford could definitely put up some points in fantasy next season with the offense that he has right now. This could be the best offense that he's played with. Now, you could definitely look at when he was with the Lions, when they had Megatron and Golden Tate. That 2014 team was pretty good with Tate and Megatron. This is one of the best offenses that Matthew Stafford has had since he's been in the NFL. So I think he's going to excel in this role. And I think that if he stays healthy and plays all 16 games, he's going to put up a productive fantasy season. Now, it's going to, depending on what league you play in, I mean, it doesn't really matter if it's PPR or standard because, quarterbacks don't catch the ball. Now, they have some trick plays and stuff. But I think that regardless, I think he could definitely be a QB1 for whatever team that you got. I mean, typically for me, I know that over the past couple of years, my draft strategy has kind of changed. And you got to try to build your position players before you get to the quarterback because there's so many good quarterbacks in the NFL that you could definitely take one late and not affect your team that much. I mean, it also all depends on the structure of your team because I know I do 2 QB leagues and you definitely want to take a QB a little bit earlier than you would as opposed to if you did like a 1 QB league. Matthew Stafford is definitely somebody you can get in the late rounds, but people are going to look at him and they're probably going to want to draft him because he's poised to have a good season. And if he's protected and he's got the weapons around him, which he does, he's going to have a productive season. And he's going to be going up against some good defenses. It's going to be interesting to see how he is in that division with the Seahawks, with the 49ers, with the Cardinals. Cardinals defense is okay. I think it's kind of taken a step back. Even with the signing of J.J. Watt, they did lose some guys on the defensive side of the ball. The Seahawks defense was a little inconsistent. 49ers defense is maybe can return to what it was back in 2019. And kind of looking at the Rams' schedule, I think they also play, if I'm not mistaken, they play the AFC South, I want to say. I want to say they play the AFC South, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so they'll be going up against the Colts, the Texans, the Jaguars, and the Titans. And outside of the Colts, the defenses in that division are pretty putrid. So Matthew Stafford could definitely take advantage of those weaker defenses and give you a great week if you get him in fantasy. But overall, I think Matthew Stafford, out of the players that I named, I didn't go in particular order. I think Matthew Stafford is the best out of the players that I named, and I think he's going to excel as a Los Angeles Ram and have a productive season. I think a lot of people would say that. I think it's hard to argue that he won't have a good season. Now, he's been banged up over the past couple of years. In 2018, he missed a large portion of the season. But I think with a good offensive line, a good running game, weapons, and he's got a good defense behind him, I think the Rams are going to be a good team, and I think Matthew Stafford's going to have a good season, and he could definitely be a number one QB for your team. And if you're doing a 2 QB league like I am, you definitely want to have him as one of your QBs in your fantasy lineup. So that's my list of the 5 players that I believe are fantasy essentials that switch teams in the offseason. So with that, we are going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about the 5 players that I am particularly interested in that I think can impact your team when you draft your fantasy teams in the summer and the early fall. So stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right, and we are back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. For our second segment, we're just going to talk about a couple players that I'm interested to see how they're going to perform on their new teams. So, to start off the list, again, this is kind of going in no particular order, no particular ranking, but the first player I want to talk about is Kenny Golladay, who signed with the New York Giants in the offseason. He's only 27 years old. He's going to be entering his 5th season in the NFL. He was a 3rd-round pick for the Detroit Lions back in 2017. And I'm really interested to see how he's going to perform with this offense. Now, Kenny Golladay only played 5 games in 2020. He was injured for most of the season, only had 2 touchdowns, had 338 receiving yards. But the year before that, 2019, he started all 16 games, had 11 touchdown receptions, and had, in standard leagues, 183 points. So he had a really good season for fantasy, and he was a part of the team that my friend had in 2019 that was arguably one of the best teams to ever be drafted in all my years of doing fantasy football, and the team that I was able to beat in the championship. So that 2019 season definitely helped him get to the championship. But again, let's kind of focus on where he is at right now with the Giants. So the Giants have been missing a number one wide receiver for the past couple of seasons now. And Kenny Golladay is kind of a guy that can go up and get 50-50 balls that are thrown his way, and he's going to draw some attention. Now, he's not a guy that's going to separate from corners that are covering him. You're going to have to throw up those 50-50 balls for him to have an impact on the game. And I think that he's going to be successful in this offense as long as he stays healthy, which is something that I've been saying a lot when I talk about each player that I bring up in these segments. You know, he only played a couple games last season. I think he definitely is going to want to prove himself. And I think he's going to be really good for the Giants. I really do. Now, again, another thing that I always bring up with these players is the quarterback position. This is the year for Daniel Jones to step up. And he's got to prove himself. He's got all the weapons around him now. This is probably the best offense that he's going to be surrounded by. I think Kenny Golladay is really going to help with that. And as a Giant fan, it would have been nice to have Kenny Golladay a couple years ago, because Eli Manning, when he was playing, he was always known to have a big wide receiver, like Plexico Burress. So I kind of related to that. Kenny Golladay is kind of like the present-day Plexico Burress, except, let's ignore the off-the-field issues that he had. But I think when it comes to fantasy, Kenny Golladay is going to get targets. He's going to get a lot of targets. When you look at 2018, he got 119 targets. 2019 had 116 targets. The guy's going to get looked at a lot. And especially when you're doing PPR leagues, that's going to definitely help. And he's a guy that you can probably get. You're probably going to want to get him a lot sooner. For a lot of the players, I've been saying you got to get him. You can get him in the later rounds, but this is a guy you're probably going to want to have to get at some point. Because one of the draft strategies that I'm kind of thinking about is getting guys that have had down years or were injured last season and try to get them early. Because I think they're going to be poised to have bounce-back seasons, which is what I'm going to talk about in the next segment. And Kenny Golladay is kind of one of those guys that I think, being injured last season, I think he's going to come out in 2021 and he's going to have a really good season. And I think he's somebody that could be a wide receiver 1, definitely a wide receiver 2, and of course, if you have a loaded receiver, if you have a lot of receivers, you could definitely put him at your flex, but he's definitely a wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2, or borderline wide receiver 1. Again, you got to be a little skeptical with who's throwing him the ball and his injury history. But I think that he's going to have a good season, and he's definitely going to be a guy that's going to be looked at when the Giants are in the red zone. And he's definitely going to put up points for you if you draft him in your fantasy leagues. All right, and next on this list, we have Emmanuel Sanders, who recently signed a contract with the Buffalo Bills. He's 34 years old. He's going to be entering his 12th season in the NFL. I'm curious to see how he's going to do as well. He had a productive season with the Saints. In standard leagues, he had 103 points. He was definitely effective at times. He had 5 touchdowns, 726 yards in 14 games with the Saints last season, with 82 targets. I'm interested to see what he's going to do in this role. The Bills have a loaded offense. The one question mark with the Bills is the running game. But when you look at the Bills, they have Stephon Diggs, they have Cole Beasley, they let go of John Brown. Gabriel Davis is kind of going to be that number 4 wide receiver, and then they have Dawson Knox at tight end. Emmanuel Sanders can definitely be productive in this offense, because I think when you look at the Saints, they had Michael Thomas, they had Kamara, they had Jared Cook, they had some guys on that team, so he's kind of in the same situation as he was with the Saints, except when you really think about it, Michael Thomas really didn't play. Jared Cook was on and off a lot. He was touchdown dependent. Emmanuel Sanders was kind of the number 1 wide receiver for the most part, unless you want to count Alvin Kamara being the number 1 wide receiver, because Drew Brees would just check it down to him on every other play. But Emmanuel Sanders, I think, has proven that he can still be productive, especially now he's 34 years old. He's getting on the older side of his career, and I think he's just looking for... I think he was looking for a spot that can help him win, that can get him to where he wants to be. And the Bills are a team that they made it to the AFC Championship game last year, and I think they're definitely going to be a force in the AFC, and I think he could be Josh Allen's security blanket, because obviously Stephon Diggs is going to get a lot of double coverage, and Josh Allen is going to want to look for guys that can get open, obviously, because that's what quarterbacks have to do. And I think Emmanuel Sanders is somebody that's going to benefit from Stephon Diggs being looked at a lot by opposing defenses, because opposing defenses are going to be focusing a majority of their game plan on Stephon Diggs and trying to neutralize him and make Josh Allen look for other weapons. And Emmanuel Sanders could be that guy. He could definitely be that guy. And I think that because of that, Emmanuel Sanders, now, he's not like Kenny Golladay, like I mentioned previously in this segment, but he's definitely somebody that can get you points, especially if you have some of your star players on bye weeks or could be injured. He's somebody that you could plug in and be your flex, maybe a number 2 wideout, but he could definitely be productive if you get him. But he's somebody you could get later on in the draft. And maybe even if he isn't drafted, you could definitely pick him up off the waiver wire. But I'm interested to see what he's going to do in this new system. Because obviously when he was with the Broncos, he was looked at as the number 1 wide receiver for a while, especially because Demaryius Thomas kind of faded out and left, and Emmanuel Sanders was, the last receiver there from the Super Bowl run back in 2015, and he was productive really throughout his whole career as a Bronco. And then obviously he started out as a Pittsburgh Steeler, but he really kind of cemented himself as a reliable wide receiver once he got to Denver, especially with those years with Peyton Manning. And I think he's going to be productive with the Bills, and he can definitely give you points, especially if Diggs is covered a lot, and Josh Allen is a gunslinger. He likes to throw the ball around. But, if you're looking for someone to give you depth, Emmanuel Sanders is definitely a wide receiver that can provide you with that. So another player on this list is Nelson Aguilar, who recently signed a contract with the New England Patriots. He's only 27 years old. He's entering his 7th season in the NFL. I'm interested to see how he's going to do with the Patriots. He was definitely coming off his best season in the NFL. In standard leagues, he had 137 points. In fantasy, and then in PPR, he had 185. So he really had a good season fantasy-wise. He's definitely somebody you could have picked up, because I know he definitely wasn't drafted in a lot of leagues. And he had a couple of good games this season. He had a good game against Tampa. He had 16 points. And this is in fantasy, obviously in fantasy, but in standard leagues, he had 16 points against the Tampa Bay Bucks. with let's see here. He had a touchdown in that game. He had over 100 yards. He had a touchdown against the Chiefs the week prior. He had 12 points in that game. His best game, I think, came in Week 16 against the Dolphins. He had over 150 yards receiving. He had a touchdown in that game. He had 21 points in that game when it comes to standard leagues. And he's a guy that can go deep. And a lot of people, well, at least a lot of Eagle fans, were not a fan of the pick when he was drafted back in 2015, and he really never panned out for the Eagles. And when you look at his season in 2020 with the Raiders, he played in all 16 games, had 82 targets, fell just short of 900 receiving yards, had 8 touchdowns. He was productive, and he averaged 18.7 yards per reception. So he was productive for the Raiders this past season. Definitely his second best season would have to be in 2017 when the Eagles won the Super Bowl. He matched his touchdown reception record with 8. So when you look at his role now with the Patriots, I think he is going to be the number 1 wide receiver alongside of Kendrick Bourne, which was the other wide receiver that the Patriots brought in. I think he's somebody that's going to get some targets, and he's definitely somebody you're going to get in the later rounds, and maybe people might not even draft him. He's definitely somebody you're going to want to have to get for depth purposes, and he could definitely be a great bench player for your team. He could definitely be a nice flex option, because I think the Patriots, when you look at them, last season their position groups were not good. Their skill position players were not good. And they went and spent a ton of money to fix the offense. And Nelson Aguilar is going to be looked at as a guy that is going to be a key contributor to that. Because I don't think Julian Edelman is going to make an impact on this team. Kendrick Bourne is definitely going to be a serviceable wide receiver. But I think when you really look at it, I think Nelson Aguilar is going to be that number 1 wide receiver. Now, I think the tight ends are going to be utilized a lot. I said that in the last segment with Jonnu Smith, alongside Hunter Henry, who was the other tight end that they brought in as well. The 2 top tight ends on the free agent market. So, with the combination of all that, I think that Nelson Aguilar is going to be productive. But I think he's somebody you're probably going to want to have to keep on your bench. Because, injuries are going to happen. And he's a guy that you could definitely pick up on the waiver wire. And definitely get, he could be like one of your last picks in your drafts, whichever kind of draft you're doing. But again, like I'm going to keep mentioning, is the quarterback position. How effective is Cam Newton going to be? Is he going to get benched at some point if he's not effective? And they're going to throw Jared Stidham in? I don't know. But I think Aguilar is definitely going to have a bigger role on the Patriots than he did with the Raiders. So, with all that, I think Nelson Aguilar is somebody that I'm interested to see how he's going to do on this new team. And in general, I'm curious to see how this offense for the New England Patriots is going to do next season, because they added so many new guys. So Nelson Aguilar is another player that I'm interested to see how he's going to do on his new team. Okay, so the next player on this list that I have, now this is kind of a wild card, and he's somebody that may not get drafted at all in a lot of leagues and might just be on the waiver wire for a while, unless someone's very desperate when it comes to the quarterback position. Now, doing 2 QB leagues, he could definitely be somebody that could be that third QB that you draft and be on your bench. But if you're doing single QB leagues, he's probably not going to get drafted and may be on the waiver wire the entire season. And that is the newly acquired Sam Darnold, quarterback for the Carolina Panthers. Now, he's clearly I think he's going to be the starting quarterback. They already talked to Teddy Bridgewater. They told him to look for other options. So odds are Teddy Bridgewater is not going to be on the Carolina Panthers when the season starts in September. But this is why I have Sam Darnold on this list. He's only 23 years old. He's entering only his 4th season in the NFL. And now that he's on the Carolina Panthers, when you look at the skill position players for the Carolina Panthers, this is probably the best supporting cast that Sam Darnold has had since he's entered the NFL back in 2018 when he was the 3rd overall pick in the 2018 NFL Draft. He's 23 years old. He's still got a lot of time to develop. Now, I know a lot of Jet fans and I know a lot of football fans will say he stinks, he's not very good, because he does make some boneheaded mistakes with the turnovers, which is a fair point. But he's only 23 years old, and he's definitely shown flashes of talent. And I think that now that he's surrounded by a much better supporting cast than all those years he had with the Jets, and now I think Matt Rule is definitely an upgrade at coach over Adam Gase. I mean, Adam Gase is regarded as really the worst head coach in the NFL. And thank God he doesn't have a job anymore. So I think a combination of no supporting cast, terrible offensive line, terrible head coach, I think now that's all gone, and I think now he's in a much better situation than he was when he was with the Jets. So I think that Sam Darnold has the potential to be a serviceable quarterback in certain spots. When you look at some of the teams that the Panthers are going to be playing against, they're going to be playing against the Falcons twice. Falcons' defense is terrible. The Bucs and the Saints, you maybe want to avoid that. If you got to plug and play them, because if your quarterback's injured or you need to pick up somebody, especially if you're doing a 1 QB league, and you want to pick him up, definitely don't pick him up when he's playing against the Bucs defense or the Saints defense. They play the Falcons twice a year. The Falcons defense is terrible against everybody. So that's definitely a week where you'd maybe want to pick him up in case you're dealing with injuries or bye weeks. So kind of looking at some of his statistics, his fantasy stats from 2020. In standard leagues, he had 134 points. That was definitely, it was the lowest of his career. He had 168 in 2018, 189 in 2019. He only played 12 games in 2020. I mean, again, these aren't stats that are going to jump out at you and be like, all right, well, I got to draft him. No, not really. But I think now he's going to have a security blanket in Christian McCaffrey. He's reunited with Robbie Anderson, and he has DJ Moore now. This offense is pretty good in terms of skill positions, and Christian McCaffrey is definitely going to want to prove himself after only playing 3 games in 2020, and he's definitely going to be a security blanket for Sam Darnold. And on the Jets, Sam Darnold was looking for Le'Veon Bell to be that security blanket, and it never really panned out. Now Christian McCaffrey is going to be that guy that Sam Darnold can rely upon in this offense to be that security blanket. Now, kind of looking at some of the games that Sam Darnold was pretty good in. So on that Thursday night game against the Broncos, he had 23 points. Against the Raiders, he had 20 points. So other than that, really didn't do anything where you're like, I got to pick him up, I got to start him every week. But I'm just interested in the situation that he's in now. He's still very young. He could still develop into a solid NFL quarterback. Not saying he's going to be Patrick Mahomes or Brady or Aaron Rodgers, but he could definitely be a serviceable quarterback in the NFL now that he's in a much better situation than he was with the Jets. And I think because of that, I have him on this list. For the last player on this list, I have wide receiver Corey Davis, who is now on the New York Jets. He spent the last 4 seasons with the Tennessee Titans. He'll be entering his 5th season in the NFL. He was drafted in the 1st round, was the 5th pick in the 2017 NFL draft by the Tennessee Titans. And Played in 14 games this past season, clearly had his best season, falling just short of 1,000 yards with 984 receiving yards, 5 touchdowns. Had 126 points in fantasy when it came to standard leagues. In PPR, he had 191 points. So he clearly improved. Had 92 targets this past season, which was the second highest in his career. In 2018, he played in all 16 games and had 112 targets. So kind of going through his games for the season, one of the games that jumps out at you is Week 13 against the Cleveland Browns, and this is for standard leagues. He had 24 points in that game, had 182 receiving yards and a touchdown. You look at the game against the Cincinnati Bengals, he had 128 receiving yards, 1 touchdown, and had 18 points in that game. And another game was the Detroit Lions game. He had 110 receiving yards, 1 touchdown, had 17 points in that game. And these are all standard league statistics. But he definitely had his best season in the NFL. And I think now when he goes to the Jets, he's going to be looked at as the number 1 wide receiver. Now, the Jets are kind of in a rebuild mode, but I think Corey Davis could definitely be somebody that you could stash on your bench, and you could definitely start him at your flex. Now, again, I'm going to say it again, the quarterback position is going to be a question mark. Now, it looks like Zach Wilson is going to be the guy that the Jets are going to take with the 2nd overall pick, the quarterback out of BYU. So we'll see if they can develop a relationship, if that is indeed who the Jets draft. But I think Corey Davis is instantly going to be the number 1 wide receiver, and he's somebody you can get in the later rounds, definitely, because there's so many options out there when it comes to wide receiver. But he's definitely somebody you could potentially draft for your bench, start him at your flex, maybe even a number 2 wide receiver on your team. Who knows? But I'm interested to see how he's going to do now that he's going to be the main wide receiver on the New York Jets. So with that is the list of players that I'm interested to see how they're going to perform on their new teams for this upcoming NFL season. So with that, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the players that I think are bound to have bounce back seasons for the 2021 NFL season. So stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
All right, and we are back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. The first 2 segments, we talked about the players that have changed teams that I think are fantasy essentials for your drafts. And then in the last segment, I talked about the players that I'm just kind of interested to see how they're going to perform on their new teams that are not necessarily fantasy essentials, but guys that you can maybe store away on your bench or possibly pick up on the waiver wire late in the seasons. So now with this segment, I'm going to talk about players that I think are poised to have bounce-back seasons for the 2021 NFL season. So with that, let's get right into it. So again, this is kind of really not going in any particular order, but one of the players that I think is poised to have a bounce-back season is, I think, kind of a risky pick because we're really waiting on this guy to really break out, is Odell Beckham Jr. And he's now going to be entering, believe it or not, his 8th season in the NFL. He was the 12th pick in the 2014 NFL Draft for the New York Giants, and he's only 28 years old. Last season, he only played in 7 games due to the fact that he tore his ACL, and that resulted in him missing pretty much the entire regular season. And it's kind of unfortunate because the Browns ended up making the playoffs and almost making it to the championship game if it wasn't for some questionable calls in that game against the Kansas City Chiefs in the divisional round. But now he's going to be back next season, and it looks like he's going to be a Cleveland Brown. Now, things can change over the next couple of months, but I think he's going to have a bounce-back season. I think because the Browns are definitely going to want to get this guy involved in the offense, and it's kind of weird considering the fact that the Browns ended up looking like a better team when Odell was out, and I think Kevin Stefanski is going to try to work to get Odell more involved, and hopefully Baker Mayfield and Odell can kind of get a better relationship going, a better rapport, so Odell can be more successful in the offense. Because I think that's one of the problems with Odell is that he's got to get involved in the offense, and you got to try to get him involved in the offense. And that was something that was a problem with the Giants, that I think Eli tried to get Odell involved a lot, and it kind of resulted in a lot of turnovers and miscues. And Odell wants to get the ball, and Odell wants to win. So, kind of looking at his statistics, his best fantasy season definitely came in 2015 when he was part of the New York Giants, when he had 1,400 yards, 13 touchdowns, had 223 points, and this is standard leagues. Last year, in 2020, he had 63 points, but again, that's only because he played in 7 games. And in 2019, his first season with the Browns, he played in all 16 games and had 127 points there. So kind of looking at the games from the 2020 season, the one that jumps out at you was obviously the Week 4 contest against the Dallas Cowboys, when he had 3 total touchdowns in that game. He had 5 receptions for 81 yards, 2 receiving touchdowns, and then he had 2 rushing attempts for 73 yards and 1 touchdown. And on those 2 rushes, he averaged 36.5 yards. And he was really good in that game. And really the main reason why the Browns won that game was very close with the Cowboys. It was a 40 to 38 kind of affair. And the Browns were up, I think, like 41 to 14 at one point in that game, and the Cowboys were trying to mount a comeback, and Odell had that big run to kind of put the nail in the coffin for the Cowboys. But that was his best game of the season in terms of fantasy, and then he kind of just didn't really do anything after that. He has been very inconsistent, but I think he's going to be motivated to have a good season. I really do. And I think that there's a possibility that maybe the Browns could trade him and maybe he'll end up somewhere else, but I just think that he's so talented that it's hard to imagine that he's not going to have a productive season. I think he's somebody you're definitely going to be able to get. He's a wide receiver too, a flex option. He's somebody you could definitely get in the later rounds because, again, you're going to be risking him for injury. He's coming back from a major injury, so I think he can definitely be somebody you get in the later rounds, whether it's PPR or standard leagues. So I have Odell as the first player that is poised to have a bounce-back season. Another player that I have that is definitely going to put up some monster numbers when it comes to fantasy is Dak Prescott. Entering his sixth season in the NFL, was the fourth-round pick in the 2016 NFL Draft for the Dallas Cowboys. 27 years old. In Week 5 of the 2020 season, he had that horrific ankle injury that made him miss the remainder of the season. And he definitely put up some monster numbers in the games that he did play in terms of fantasy. When you look at Week 2 against Atlanta, he had 39 points. In Week 3 against Seattle, he had 27. In Week 4 against Cleveland, he had 37. So Dak Prescott puts up great numbers when it comes to fantasy. Now, in terms of real life, it's all garbage points that the Cowboys are getting. And the Cowboys were down by a lot in a lot of these games that they played early on with Dak Prescott. And he would be putting up a lot of garbage yards and garbage touchdowns when it really wouldn't matter. Especially against the Browns. I mean, obviously the Atlanta game they won. The Seattle game, it actually did get close at one point. The Cowboys actually took the lead at that point. But a lot of Dak Prescott's points comes in garbage time. But when it comes to fantasy, that's what you need. And he's definitely a quarterback that's going to put up a lot of numbers, especially with the offense that he has, with the skill position players, with Amari Cooper, with CeeDee Lamb, with Michael Gallup and Ezekiel Elliott. The Cowboys are going to put up points. And Dak is definitely going to put up some numbers, and he's definitely somebody that you can get in the later rounds. He's definitely somebody that can be a QB1 because of the garbage numbers that he puts up. And the Cowboys are going to put up points this season. And when you look at Dak Prescott's history in terms of fantasy, 2019 was clearly his best season when it came to fantasy. He had 337 points. 2018, he had 285. 2017, 260. 2016, he had 286. In 2020, he only had 134, but that is, of course, because of the injury that he sustained in Week 5 against the Giants. But he's a guy that, again, like I keep saying, he's going to put up a lot of points. And in 2019, he averaged about, I just had the number here, he averaged about 21 points in fantasy. In 2020, he averaged 26.9, which is, if you round up, it's going to be 27. That's really good in the games that he played. And that just shows you how good the Cowboys can be offensively when it comes to fantasy. Like I keep saying, a lot of these points come when the Cowboys are down by a lot, because the Cowboys were trailing a lot. They pretty much trailed in every game that Dak Prescott started, and they had to climb their way back into games, and it had to make Dak Prescott had to start throwing it around a lot, and because of that, he can get you some points. I mean, the thing that's troubling was the turnovers. He had 2 interceptions against Seattle. He had one against the Browns and one against the Giants. But again, also, collectively as a team, the Cowboys were turning the ball over. Ezekiel Elliott was fumbling a lot. But like I said, I think Dak Prescott can definitely be a number 1 QB for you in your fantasy league. I think it's a little risky because he is coming back from a really tough injury. And, as long as he stays healthy, he's definitely going to put up numbers for you. And he's definitely going to be a solid quarterback when it comes to fantasy. Another player that I have on this list is Carson Wentz, who is now an Indianapolis Colt. He was traded from the Eagles to the Colts. He's going to be entering his 6th season in the NFL. He was the 2nd overall pick in the 2016 NFL Draft. I think he's poised to have a really good season for the Colts. kind of looking at his statistics, his best season obviously came in 2017 when he had 281 fantasy points, averaging 21 points per game when it came to fantasy, only playing in 13 games. And he should have won the MVP if he didn't tear his ACL against the Rams in Week 15. Had over 3,000 yards, 33 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. And if you really look at his rookie year he had 16 touchdowns to 14 interceptions. And then in 2020, in 12 games, he had 16 touchdowns to 15 interceptions. So he kind of started to decline ever since the ACL injury. In 2018, he only played 11 games, had 21 touchdowns to 7 interceptions. 2019, he had a pretty good season, playing in 16 games, had over 4,000 yards, 27 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, had 275 fantasy points. Was definitely a solid fantasy quarterback in 2019. In 2020, not so much. I had to make a trade last season, I guess, because now you can consider 2020 to be last season. I was kind of desperate. I had some injuries, so I had to kind of make a sacrifice, and I ended up trading for Carson Wentz last year to be my QB2, because I do a 2 QB league. And it kind of panned out a little bit in the beginning, and then he just was not being productive at all. So I was fortunate enough that I picked up Jalen Hurts, and Jalen Hurts was able to finish up the season for me, and Jalen Hurts was pretty productive. But Carson Wentz was pretty bad last season, and because of that, he deserved to get benched for Jalen Hurts. And, looking at some of the games that he played in, he did have some good games. Against the Bengals, 21 points. Against the 49ers, he had 21. Against the Steelers, 17, but he had a couple of turnovers in that game. The 2 best games were against the Giants and the Ravens. In Week 6, against the Ravens, he had 29 points. In Week 7, he had 27 against the Giants. Threw for 359 yards, 2 touchdowns. So he had a couple of good games sprinkled into that dreadful season that he had. But, like I said, he did deserve to get benched. I kind of knew it was coming when he started against Green Bay. I think that was when I knew he was going to get benched. So I ended up not starting him that week. I think I started Mitchell Trubisky that week. So I had Mitchell Trubisky and Aaron Rodgers starting. Because Trubisky, he got benched, and then he got put back in. And he actually started playing pretty good in terms of fantasy. So I started him because I knew the benching of Carson Wentz was eventually going to happen. And I think a lot of people knew that as well. But let's talk about now the team that he's currently on, which is the Indianapolis Colts. He gets paired up with Frank Reich again, who was the offensive coordinator for the Colts back in 2017, when Carson Wentz had his MVP season, like I previously mentioned, with the 33 touchdowns and the 7 interceptions. Like I said, if he doesn't get injured, I think he wins the MVP. And I think a lot of people would agree with that. And now Carson Wentz is going to be behind an offensive line that's top 3 in the league. So Carson Wentz is going to be protected. I think that's the other reason why Carson Wentz really didn't have a good season last year, is because he really wasn't protected that well. Also, his weapons were in and out of the lineup. The Colts did bring back T.Y. Hilton. They have Michael Pittman. They have Jack Doyle at tight end. And they got Jonathan Taylor coming out of the backfield. So the Colts got a really good offense. The missing piece is the quarterback for them, and I think they got it in Carson Wentz. I think Carson Wentz is going to have a good season. I really do. As long as he's protected, his weapons aren't in and out of the lineup like they were in Philadelphia, because, Alshon Jeffrey, Deshaun Jackson were constantly injured. They were in and out of the lineup. There was no consistency for Carson Wentz last year. I think this is the best team that Carson Wentz has been surrounded by. Because now, you could say the 2017 Eagles offense was pretty good, and it was. It was. But I think the offensive line for the Colts maybe is a little bit better than the offensive line that Carson Wentz had back in 2017, and I think Jonathan Taylor is better than LeGarrette Blount and Jay Ajayi. Comparing the 2017 LeGarrette Blount and Jay Ajayi, obviously these guys aren't in the league anymore. So let's see how Carson Wentz does. I expect him to be a solid quarterback this year, and I think he could be a QB1. I know definitely, from doing a 2 QB league, definitely a guy that I'm going to have on my radar to be a QB2, because I know he could be productive, and I know he's talented, and I know that he can give you points, and especially when you're going up against the Texans defense, the Titans defense, and the Jacksonville defense, I think the Colts are definitely going to take advantage of playing against these weaker defenses. And because of that, Carson Wentz is going to have a solid fantasy season. He definitely is. You probably get him in the later rounds, because everybody values the running back position, the wide receiver position. So Carson Wentz is somebody you could probably definitely get in like the 8th or 9th round, I'm going to say. But like I said, playing in a 2 QB league for me, he's somebody that I'm definitely going to have on my radar. So Carson Wentz is another player that I expect to have a bounce-back season when we get to the fall. So for the next player on my list, I have the running back for the Dallas Cowboys, Ezekiel Elliott, entering his 6th season in the NFL, was drafted in the first round, and was the 4th overall pick in the 2016 NFL draft by the Dallas Cowboys, 25 years old. Last season was definitely by far his worst season in the NFL, and it had to do with a lot of different things. First and most notably, Dak Prescott being injured in Week 5. I think that really affected Zeke's production because Andy Dalton is not Dak Prescott. Ben DiNucci and Garrett Gilbert are not Dak Prescott. And last season kind of gave me a little bit more respect for Dak Prescott because the Cowboys really needed him. And Dak Prescott got paid, and to be honest, he deserved it because the Cowboys really fell off a cliff without Dak Prescott in the lineup. So in 15 games for Ezekiel Elliott, he fell just short of 1,000 yards, had 979 yards, averaged only 4 yards per carry, which is his career low, only had 6 touchdowns, had 6 fumbles, and had his least amount of fantasy points with 171. His best season was obviously 2016 when he played in 15 games, had 1,600 yards, was averaging 5 yards per carry, 15 rushing touchdowns, and had 293 fantasy points, and that's standard leagues. He's kind of declined a little bit over the past couple of years because, when you look at the running back position, the wear and tear, the running in between the tackles and constantly getting hit all the time. I mean, it takes a toll on your body, and I think you can kind of see that with Ezekiel Elliott. I think he's going to have a bounce-back season. I really do. As long as, the other thing I forgot to mention, along with Dak Prescott getting injured, the offensive line for the Cowboys was putrid, especially because Zach Martin was injured, La'el Collins was injured, Tyron Smith was injured. They were in and out of the lineup. At least Zach Martin was in and out of the lineup. I don't think Tyron Smith played a game. He might have played one, but he was out pretty much the whole season. La'el Collins, they don't know if he's ever going to come back. And Zach Martin's been in and out of the lineup. And obviously Travis Frederick, who was the longtime center for the Cowboys, he retired in the offseason. So the Cowboys' offensive line is not what it used to be. And that was definitely a problem because he could not really do much last year. So the combination of the offensive line and Dak Prescott being injured kind of had to do with the fact that Zeke really didn't have a good season. Now, he had a good start to the season. 24 points in Week 1 against the Rams, 16 against the Falcons. He had 2 fumbles in that game, so that kind of hurt him a little bit. Had 22 points against the Giants, and that was kind of when that was the game when Dak got hurt. So that was the last game he ever reached 20 points in the 2020 season. Then he had 4 the week after that, 5, 7, 6. Had 17 against the Vikings. Then he had barely 2 against the Washington football team. Then he had 9.5 against the Ravens, 5.9 against the Bengals, 13 against the Eagles, and then he had 12 against the Giants in Week 17. So when you think about Ezekiel Elliott, he's a guy that is supposed to get you 20, 30 points a game, and he really was not doing that last year. And he's a guy that you got to take in the first round. And I expect him to be a first-round pick again, especially with Dak coming back, and I think the offensive line is going to be healthier. So I think Zeke is definitely going to have a bounce-back season, and he is another player that I expect to have a bounce back season. Now, I don't expect him to be what he was in 2016, but I think he's going to be productive. He's going to have more 20-point games in fantasy and a couple of 30 points sprinkled in there as well, because I think the offensive line is going to be better, and Dak Prescott's back. So Ezekiel Elliott is another player that I think is poised to have a bounce back season in 2021. So for the last player on this list, I have Michael Thomas, the wide receiver for the Saints. He's going to be entering his sixth season in the NFL, was taken in the second round of the 2016 NFL draft, 28 years old. I think he's going to have a bounce-back season. I think, only playing in 7 games last year, having 0 touchdowns in the regular season, I think he's going to want to prove himself. I really do. And now Drew Brees is no longer there, so it's going to be interesting to see how he's going to do with whether it's Jameis Winston starting, which I think Jameis Winston is going to be the starter, or Taysom Hill, whoever it's going to be. I think Michael Thomas is going to have a productive season. Now, I don't know if he's going to be a first-round pick because, again, you got to see how the QB play is, but I think he's going to be a lot better than what he was in 2020. His best season was in 2019 when he had 225 points in 2019, this is in standard leagues. When he had 9 touchdowns, he had 1,700 yards receiving in 16 games that he played. Was targeted 185 times. And that's another thing that benefits Michael Thomas is he's going to be a high-volume guy. He's somebody that's going to get the ball a lot. He's going to get the ball thrown his way a lot because, he's one of the top wide receivers in the league when he's healthy. And really didn't do anything in any of the games that he played in. The most points that he had, and this is in standard leagues for 2020, he had 10.5 points against the Falcons in Week 13. He really didn't do much in any games that he played in, which, it had to do with injuries, it had to do with, suspension. He had a lot going on last year, but I think he's going to have a bounce-back season. I really do. And I think he's going to be one of the top wide receivers that's taken off the board when it comes to fantasy. He's definitely going to be, top 5 receiver come next year. So that's the list of the 5 players that I think are going to be bound to have bounce-back seasons come 2021. So with that, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the 5 players that were some of my favorite picks over the years that I've done fantasy. So stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network.
Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? The GSMC College Football Podcast is your ticket to all things college football. Join us as we talk college football from the national championship, the college rivalries, the bowl game, to the Heisman Trophy. To which conference is the best? We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, the Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between. Download the GSMC College Football Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
All right, and we are back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast for the last segment of the show for today. So in the first segment, I talked about players that switch teams that I think are fantasy essentials. These are guys that you want to have on your team. The second segment was about players that not necessarily are fantasy essentials, but players that I'm interested to see how they're going to perform on their new teams that you can maybe add as the season progresses. The third segment was on how I think some players are going to have bounce-back seasons, guys that got injured, guys that had down years in 2020, and guys that I think are going to rebound in 2021. And then for this final segment, I'm just going to talk about players that helped me get to my championship games, helped me win my leagues, and guys that just guys that I liked and enjoyed to have on my teams in the past. So to go into the list, not in any specific order because it was kind of hard to rank these players. The first player I'm going to talk about is David Johnson, and this is not the present-day David Johnson. This is David Johnson from 2016, where this was his first full season as a pro in the NFL, getting drafted as a rookie for the Cardinals back in 2015, and definitely had an impact on that Cardinals team in 2015. That Cardinals team got to the championship game, and they got absolutely throttled by the Carolina Panthers that year. David Johnson is, believe it or not, entering his 7th season in the NFL. He was picked in the 3rd round of the 2015 NFL draft by the Arizona Cardinals. He's 29 years old. Now, this past season had 146 points. Obviously, not his best showing, but 2016 is the year I want to talk about. 327 points in standard leagues, and then in PPR he had 407 points. So he was fantastic that year. Had 16 rushing touchdowns, had 4 receiving touchdowns. He was incredible that year. He really was. And kind of going into specific games, you look at some of the best games that he had. In Week 5 of that year against the 49ers, he had 29 points. Against the Jets, he had 31 points in that game. And looking at the other games that he did well in, he had 21 points against the 49ers again. He had 27 against the Vikings. He had 21 against the Falcons, 29 against the Washington football team. He had 29 in Week 16 against the Seahawks, which was a very entertaining game. I remember that was a game that was played on Christmas Eve that year. And he was just amazing that year. He really was a key component to my team, and he helped propel my team to a championship that year and got me my 2nd ring in my league that I do with my friends from home. And he was very important and kind of a guy that, reminds me of the fact that the running back position in fantasy football is very crucial, and it might honestly be the most important position because you got to have good running backs. And in the past, I didn't really value running backs as much, and when I had David Johnson that year, I still didn't value running backs as much as I do for when it comes to receivers and quarterbacks. But David Johnson in 2016 was an amazing pick, and he, again, was a key contributor for me getting a championship that year in fantasy. So, my next player that I'm going to talk about that I was so happy to have on my team this year was the running back for the Cleveland Browns, Nick Chubb. He's going to be entering his 4th season in the NFL. He was drafted by the Browns in 2018. He was a 2nd-round pick, 25 years old. And see, now, with David Johnson, like I said, I didn't value the running back position as much as I do now. Nick Chubb, I made sure to get in the 2nd round of my draft. He was the first running back that I took. And listen, the guy in 12 games put up fantastic numbers, having 12 rushing touchdowns, over 1,000 yards, only fumbled once, had 191 points, and this is in standard leagues. In 2019, he had 219 points. But specifically in 2020, Nick Chubb was one of the key contributors for me to make the playoffs. My team would not have made the playoffs if Nick Chubb wasn't on my team. Now, Nick Chubb got hurt in Week 4 against the Cowboys, and that kind of derailed my season a little bit because I really didn't have another running back that I could really depend on. So I was scrambling to get another running back. I traded for James Conner. I had to give up a hefty package. I unfortunately had to trade Deshaun Watson. Now, this is a 2 QB league. My other QB was Aaron Rodgers, who is going to be on the list a little bit later in this segment. But Yeah, so I had to trade I had to trade Deshaun Watson and Tyler Lockett for James Conner, Carson Wentz, and I think DJ Moore. So at the time, it was kind of a fair trade, and I probably wouldn't have made the playoffs if it wasn't for that trade as well. But I had to do it because Nick Chubb was my number one running back, and he's a bell cow. You know, he gets really most of the carries. I mean, he does split time with Kareem Hunt, but they make it work. They got the best 1-2 punch in the NFL when it comes to running backs, in my opinion. But going through some of the statistics specifically for 2020, in Week 2, he had 25 points against the Bengals. He had 23 points against the Jaguars. He had 22 against the Ravens. And he was just super consistent. That was the other thing with Nick Chubb, is he was super consistent, especially when he came back from the injury. I mean, he didn't really have any games where he was in single digits. I mean, the only two games that he was in single digits was the Week 1 contest against the Ravens and then the Week 4 contest against the Cowboys when he had to leave the game due to an injury that left him out for a couple games. But he was just fun to watch. He's fun to watch. The one thing that really got me upset was when he came back against the Texans, had over 100 yards, had a touchdown in this game, and at the end of the game, there was about a minute left. He breaks to the outside. He's running down the sideline, and I'm saying to myself, he's going to score a touchdown, give me some fantasy points, and maybe propel me to a victory. Unfortunately, I got killed in this matchup when the second half games rolled around. I turned around. I was celebrating. I'm like, he scored a touchdown, and my cousin tells me he stepped out of bounds. And I turn around, and he stepped out at the 1 yard line because, they wanted to end the game. So that's one thing that I was very upset about when it came to Nick Chubb. So Nick Chubb is another player that I really enjoyed having on my team in 2020. And, hopefully I can get him again. All right, so the next player I'm going to talk about is the wide receiver for the Green Bay Packers, Davante Adams. 28 years old, entering his 8th season in the NFL, was drafted in the second round in 2014. Had a productive season his rookie year. Not in terms of fantasy, but, when it comes to real life. In 2015, however, many Packer fans just wanted to see this guy gone, wanted to see this guy get cut and just not be on the team anymore. And listen, Davante Adams, he shows up in January, especially those first 2 years, 2014, 2015, he had productive postseasons as well. Davante Adams could have maybe been cut at some point if he didn't, start training, correcting the mistakes that he was making in his first couple of seasons in the NFL. And now when you look at him in the present day, he's one of the best receivers in the game. I mean, this past season, 2020, he had a monster season. When you look at the standard numbers in fantasy, 243 in standard leagues, and then in PPR, 358. And he's a high-volume guy, and Aaron Rodgers relied upon him a lot. Caught Aaron Rodgers' 400 touchdown pass. I mean, when you look at the games, some of his best games, and he did miss 2 games in 2020. When you look at some of his best games, you got 27 points in Week 1 against the Vikings. He had 2 touchdowns at over 150 receiving yards. In Week 7 against the Texans, he had 3 touchdowns that game. 2 touchdowns that game. I thought he had 3. I thought he had 3 in that. All right. Well, apparently, okay. So he just had 2 touchdowns in that game. Had 196 receiving yards. Had 31 points that game. Following week against Minnesota, that's when he had the 3 touchdowns. In that game, he had 23 points. Had 23 points against the 49ers. Had 24 points against the Eagles. Had 32 points against the Tennessee Titans. The one thing that, again, got me mad was I needed him to have a big game in my round 1 matchup of the playoffs, and he chose Week 15 against the Carolina Panthers, which was the beginning of the playoffs for fantasy, to only have 4 points. And I also had Aaron Rodgers in my league, and he didn't particularly have a great game as well. So, yeah, outside of that, Davante Adams was amazing to have on my team this year. I mean, he was everywhere making amazing catches and really is, I think, the best receiver in the game. I think his route running is the best in the league. I think he's got the best hands in the league. Now, he did drop a crucial pass in the NFC Championship game that could have maybe changed the outcome of that game a little bit. He dropped a touchdown and Green Bay had to kick a field goal. But, like I said, outside of that and, pretty much laying an egg when I needed him to continue his consistency in the fantasy playoffs. I mean, Davante Adams was great. And, he's definitely going to be on my radar and might be my first pick. I don't know where I'm going to be picking this year. But if I'm picking, if I'm like if I got 4 through 6, I think Davante Adams might be my first pick. I mean, how could you can't go wrong with that. Now, the injuries is something you got to be a little bit concerned about because he did miss 2 games and then he missed 4 games the previous year. So that's something you got to be a little bit concerned about. But listen, I loved having him on my team. I loved having him and Nick Chubb. I think that was probably my best first 2 picks that I've made since I've done fantasy. Because sometimes I would draft a QB early, and now we kind of live in this day and age where you can kind of wait on taking a QB in the later rounds, and you gotta build your team. You gotta build up your team. But having Nick Chubb and Davante Adams was a lot of fun. It was great to have these guys on my team. Unfortunately, I couldn't win the championship this year in my friends league, but you know what? Hey, it's fine. If I can get those 2 guys again, absolutely would do it again. So Davante Adams is the next player on this list that I had. So now moving on to another player that I loved having, and it's kind of a very popular pick. I mean, it's kind of not really a shocker here, is Patrick Mahomes. I got him in 2019. I picked him I picked him in the 3rd round, I think. Because what I did was, because we had the snake format, so I drafted Todd Gurley and Michael Thomas. And then I was going to draft either a receiver or a running back and then a quarterback with my next 2 picks since I would have back-to-back. So I did Michael Thomas and Gurley first, and then when it was my second time to go, I believe I took Adam Thielen, and then I took Patrick Mahomes. And this is a 2 QB league, so I wanted to get a QB early, and I think he's the best quarterback in the NFL, and I think a lot of other people would agree with that statement as well. And, when you look at his statistics in standard leagues, 417 points in 2018. He had 287 in 2019 because he did miss 2 games due to the injury that he suffered against the Broncos, which I got to be honest, I thought my season was over. I thought I was missing the playoffs at that point. I thought there was no chance I was going to do anything. I thought the sky was falling. I was panicking and everything. But you know what? Patrick Mahomes was able to come back, and he was able to help me get a championship again and get my 3rd ring in my friends league. But he's just in general, he's just so exciting to watch. He's so exciting to watch, and you could definitely depend on him to carry your team because he is one of those quarterbacks that can definitely put up the same numbers as a receiver, as a running back, because he's just so special. I mean, he's mobile, and Chiefs are always, for the most part, blowing people out, other than, this past Super Bowl where they only put up 9 points. That's not going to happen on a consistent basis with the Chiefs. The Chiefs are going to, get that stuff corrected for next season. But Patrick Mahomes, I definitely was confident when he came back that he was going to help me get to where I needed to be. And because I ended up winning out, all my games in 2019. I think I won my last, including the playoffs, I won my last 4 or 5 matchups. And that helped me get to the playoffs and get to the championship and win it against my friend who had a great team, who had really the best team all year. So, yeah, Patrick Mahomes, can't go wrong with him. like I said with Chubb and Devontae Adams, if he's available, got to make sure to get him. Especially in a 2 QB league when, QBs are kind of more valued in 2 QB leagues as opposed to, 1 QB leagues. And then for the last player on my list is probably my favorite player in the NFL right now. Just won his 3rd MVP. And listen, I wish he would have made it to the Super Bowl and got his 2nd ring because he most definitely deserves it. And that is the quarterback for the Green Bay Packers, Aaron Rodgers, who will be entering his 17th season in the NFL, was taken in the first round of the 2005 NFL Draft by the Packers, and obviously a lot of people know that there was a bit of a controversy with that. Alex Smith was the first QB taken in that draft. He was taken number 1 overall by the 49ers, and believe it or not, Mike McCarthy, who was the coach for the Packers for a long time, was on the staff of the 49ers at that time. So, Aaron Rodgers, had a little chip on his shoulder. And, he's had an okay career so far. Now, in all seriousness, he hasn't had the career that some other quarterbacks have had, and definitely deserves to win. Definitely needs to win another Super Bowl, and who knows if he's ever going to get to that point again. But this past season in 2020, played in 16 games, had over 4,000 yards, 48 touchdowns to 5 interceptions, and he had over 50 touchdowns if you want to count the postseason. Had a rating of 121, and had 382 points in fantasy, and this is standard leagues. I mean, he was amazing this year. He was really amazing, and he wasn't the first QB I took because this is the QB the 2 QB league that I'm in with my friends. That's kind of like the main league that I do each year. But he wasn't the first QB that I took. Deshaun Watson was. And I don't think Deshaun Watson is going to be a QB that I'm going to take again because, he's got a lot of stuff going on right now if you've been paying attention to the news. But Deshaun Watson was the first QB that I took. And, listen, I'm an Aaron Rodgers fan, and I said, you know what, he'd definitely be a good QB too. Because, listen, he had a nice 2019 season. He had 26 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. I mean, that's half, pretty much half of what he had in 2020. I did not expect Aaron Rodgers to have the season that he had in 2020. I thought Aaron Rodgers was going to, still be good, but not what he was in 2020. I mean, he was amazing in 2020. Outside of the championship game where the Packers got 3 turnovers off of Tom Brady, and Aaron Rodgers really only got 6 points from that. Aaron Rodgers was great. He was clearly the best quarterback in the NFL in 2020, and knowing that he was playing like a QB1, that made me more comfortable to give up Deshaun Watson, to get some running back depth, like I was talking about before. In 2019, it just seemed like he just wasn't the same Aaron Rodgers. Now, you could say he was trying to get used to the system, the new system with Matt LaFleur, and, that's definitely true because he doubled his touchdowns. Yes, he threw one more interception than he did in 2019, 5-4, but Aaron Rodgers, for the most part, he's always throwing single-digit interceptions. You don't really have to worry about him when it comes to turning the ball over, and that's why he's one of the best quarterbacks to take in fantasy because he doesn't turn the ball over. And that's something that definitely gets people infuriated is when you got QBs that constantly turn the ball over. Because I remember one year my friend started Ryan Fitzpatrick, and he threw 6 interceptions against the Kansas City Chiefs back in 2016. Now, I put Aaron Rodgers in general. There really isn't a specific year because I've had Aaron Rodgers on my team numerous times. He's a guy that I always am looking to draft. Now, I've gotten better at not overdrafting for him because I've taken him in the 2nd round, and then the rest of my team would end up suffering because of that. But he's a guy that I am always looking to have on my team, and I think he's going to be productive next year. I think he's got a couple good years left in him. I really do. And I think he's a QB1. I think I'm comfortable in saying that. So if you got guys like Patrick Mahomes getting taken, listen, Aaron Rodgers is 37. He's not like what he was 5 or 6 years ago, obviously, but he's still going to be productive, and, you could definitely build your team up and get him in, I think I got him in like the 7th or 8th round in the 2QB draft that I do with my friends. So, he's going to be there. So, if you get, your running backs and your wide receivers situated and you think that you're ready to draft a QB and he's there, definitely take him. Definitely take him, because I anticipate that he's going to have another good season, another productive season. And again, as long as he doesn't get hurt. And that goes for pretty much everybody, So, yeah, so that's those are the players that I have enjoyed picking that, have helped propel me to championships in my fantasy league. So David Johnson back in 2016, Nick Chubb and Devontae Adams in 2020, Aaron Rodgers in general, and of course Patrick Mahomes back in 2019. Those are the players from this list that I chose for this list. So with that is all the time that we have for today. Thank you for listening to the show, the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Just remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us out. And also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, we will greatly appreciate it. So, I'm Kenneth Grunfelder signing off from the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Have a good day, and we will see you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.